Welcome, everyone. Excited to have you guys all join as we discuss this panel. I think it's a very interesting topic that we all should be intrigued by and preparing for the future and just preparing for the post-quantum era. And today we're blessed to have some of the best industry leaders in this space to discuss what they're doing in their organizations and also some of the trends that we're seeing as we prepare for this shift in the future. There's just so everyone knows, we have a Q&A for that we're saving for the end. Please feel free to post your questions as we go through the deck. We'll get to them all at the end. And please, any question is a good question. Don't feel like there's a dumb question here, right? This is all a space that we're all preparing for, and we want as much knowledge around this space. So please feel free to share whatever questions you may have at the end. So I want to start out right now. We'll start out with a brief introduction of the team that we have here. I'll start out with myself, Tray Bullock. I'm the Director of Brand Services here at BrandShelter. I've been in the domain cybersecurity industry for around 20 years now, specializing in all types of fraud, brand protection, as well as securing domains on anything in the online or marketplace. I have a wealth of knowledge in fraud investigations as well. From a banking side, I used to run a security operations center, which specialized in fraud and intrusions. Will, I'll pass it to you.
So I'm Will Collison. I'm the Technical Director of Cryptography here at HSBC. So I lead the capability and the function of cryptography across the entire organization. So I look after everything from hardware security modules to public key infrastructure to the strategy and the direction that we're taking here at HSBC. And that includes our quantum safety program and the activities that we'll be doing to get ready for the threat of quantum computing.
Thank you. We'll move on to you, Dean.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dean Coclin, Senior Director of Industry Strategy at DigiCert. I'm not sure how familiar people are with DigiCert. Probably not a household name, but you are probably familiar with the name VeriSign. VeriSign was the first public key infrastructure company to issue digital certificates for websites back in 1995. That company grew and was acquired by Symantec in 2010. And then Symantec sold the PKI business to DigiCert in 2017. And that's where we are today. I'm also chair of an organization called the CA Browser Forum, which is an industry standards body, providing standards for website server certificates, code signing certificates, and secure email certificates. And I also chair an organization called the X9 PKI Policy Committee, which is a PKI that's geared towards the financial community. Thank you.
And my name is Geir Rasmussen, and I'm a namespace security architect with Klarvant. So namespace security, what is that? So we are specialists at mapping the namespaces of large organizations. And this comes from my background, which is in the TLD world. Some background from VeriSign there, Dean. And we focus on helping organizations inventory and classify their inventories.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to transition just to set the stage. Just want to discuss like some for the group. We want to set the stage with some core sections here as we get prepared for the slide deck, just so the audience can understand what we're going to inform them on. Basically, we want to set the stage for the audience. I want to just let you guys know that we're going to be covering some core sections here. Within these core sections, we're going to talk about what changes in quantum computing, right? What to expect, what the actually risks are, because this is all the future. And sometimes we're planning for the future. You can never get everything right. So some of this stuff is just what we've seen from our expertise in the background, and what we're trying to plan for as this whole thing evolves. And what's the current state of the readiness right now, right? What we can see, what we're going to prepare for, right? And last, what organizations should be doing now, and how they should be thinking about this from a futuristic approach, 5 years, 10 years, right? How this is going to change what we do here in this space. So I want to start off with this slide is the PQC awareness curve, and this is a great way to showcase and express what's going on now. So, Dean, if you could shed some light on this, please.
Sure. I love to start with this slide in these PQC presentations, just to kind of lighten things up a little bit. It's a little humorous, but it's actually, you can bring it home. When you start thinking about PQC, a lot of people say, oh, that's so far away, I don't have to worry about that, and we're not really impacted by that. So they're kind of in that denial phase. But then when they hear some of the news and start looking into it a little bit more, they're saying, I probably don't have to worry about this for a long time. I might be retired by then, who knows? So we start kind of bargaining and doing some trade-offs. But then when reality hits, there's anger because they say, oh my goodness, there's a lot of work here to do. We've got hardware to update. We've got an inventory to take. We've got to figure out what we're going to do, who's impacted, what about our partners and our customers. And then after all that, after the anger, then you get into this depression phase and you say, wow, we are really screwed here, so to speak. Excuse me. But after you get through that, after you get some more information, you talk to vendors, you talk to industry experts like the ones we have here, you accept the reality and say, all right, we need to start to build a plan and we need to begin tackling this. And I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, with the experts that you have here, you will all be in that acceptance phase.
Sorry, I was muted. No, that's a good introduction into what we're going to discuss today. I think this slide highlights all of the emotions that we're all going to face, to be honest with you, in whatever organization we're in right now, in this as we navigate through some of these challenges in our organization structures. All right, PQC, sorry, and why it matters now. I think this is a good opportunity to kind of like discuss where we are now and how we're going to kind of prepare for the future. So I think this is a good section for you to continue on, Dean, because this kind of goes into the transition of the mixed emotions that everyone will feel in this space as they try to navigate these issues in the future.
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit. Before we talk about quantum computing, I think we need to first understand classical computing so that we can make more sense out of what quantum computing is. Typically with classical computing, which has been around since, at least World War II, when rooms would be filled with vacuum tubes, that was the first computer. Then things moved on to transistors and integrated circuits. At the end of the day, what these devices do is they are electronic switches. They either allow current to flow or not. And the output of that is either going to be that the system is on or it's off. And when you transfer that to math, it's either going to be a 1 on or a 0 off. And that's the basis of classical computing today. We manipulate it with things like AND gates, OR gates, DAND gates, NOR gates, all of these different mathematical principles. But at the end of the day, the output is either a 1 or a 0. Now, quantum computing does things a little bit differently. And I'm not a mathematician or a physicist, so I'm not going to explain the details of how it works. But what's important to understand is the outcome. Quantum computing works on something called qubits. And qubits have a property that allows it to express itself as a 1 and a 0 at the same time. And the effect of that is to actually speed up calculations, mathematical calculations, so that we can efficiently solve problems which today on classical computers would take thousands or millions of years. And some of the practical problems are things like logistics. How do we get from point A to point B with 15 stops in between the most efficient way? The best way to think of a classical computer versus a quantum computer is to think of a maze. What's a maze? A maze has one input and one output, but many different paths along the way. Now, a classical computer would try to solve that maze by trying each path one at a time. Does this path work? No. Does this path work? No. Does this path work? Yes. And if we finally get to the solution. Now imagine if that maze had 1,000 paths or 1,000,000 paths. It would take a classical computer a long time to solve that. A quantum computer, however, would try to solve that maze by going through each path all at the same time. So by that, you could quickly get the answer. And that has a lot of good practical applications from logistics, medicine, chemicals. but it also can impact and do solving of complex mathematical problems like the ones that are used to secure our cryptography today. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more on the coming slides, is how this impacts our current cryptographic systems. So we shouldn't have to wait for quantum computers to come out before we start moving to post-quantum cryptography, because there's this concept today of harvest now and decrypt later. And I'm actually going to ask Will to actually talk a little bit about what this means, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to echo a couple of Dean's comments, because I always like to use a bit of a pithy line on the movement between classical computers and quantum computers. I always look at silicon chips and say, hey, we tricked sand into doing mathematics for us, and now we're going to trick light into doing mathematics for us, and it doesn't seem that it wants to follow the same rules as we've looked at before. And it's worth remembering as well that we've had that 50 years with some of the key cryptographic algorithms that we use, and we've built an entire internet around them, and they are very much attuned to classical computing. And you know, that example of, hey, breaking some of the mathematics problems for them is a trillion-year problem, and a quantum computer could make that into a 2-week problem. Now, when we look at the data that we have at the moment, we need to remember that we are dealing with a situation where in the future there will or may be a system which is capable of looking at that data and unpicking the puzzles that we've set mathematically around it. And so when we talk about harvest now, decrypt later, we talk about data that you have now which you are confident is secure and secret, and that would include things like your internet banking sessions. And so looking at those and saying, what if somebody was able to record all of the encrypted garbage and mathematical nonsense that is in there and look at it in X number of years and be able to quickly unpick that lock and see exactly what you were doing on your banking. Now, that can apply in a lot of different ways. So I'll be honest, if you want to look at what I was doing with my bank account 15 years ago, on your head be it, it wasn't particularly interesting. Okay. But lots of organizations have lots of things which need to remain a secret for a long time. And that's not just because of the confidentiality and protecting of customers, which is obviously one of HSBC's top priorities. But other organizations will have secret things that they are developing. I talked to a colleague in the drug industry, for example, and they are developing drugs. And those drugs and those trials have to remain secret. They have to remain confidential, way beyond the time at which we might have a quantum computer which can decrypt it. So we urge people to start thinking about, what data do you have that is secret now and also needs to remain secret for a long time into the future. And so that's what we talk about. We talk about harvest now, decrypt later. The idea that people are collecting huge amounts of data and have the ability at some point in the future to decrypt and analyze that data. You need to start working now to make sure that you know, first off, where that data is, what that data is, and second off, look at the tools that are available today in order to protect it, in order to wrap it up in nice quantum safe algorithms. And that does lead us on to the next question. You know, why should enterprises begin preparing for the transition to quantum safe cryptography now rather than later? So first off, you've got data now that could be at risk from a quantum computer in the future. You need to start looking at how you're going to protect that data. You need to start doing the steps that you need to do in order to protect that data. But the other thing that really should play into people's minds, Dean talked a little bit about the uncertainty of a quantum computer existing. I've talked before about how the quantum computing threat is the year 2000 problem. I've had to do that in front of university students where they weren't even born when the year 2000 problem was an issue, and I've had to explain that it was to do with how we all thought that computers built in the 20th century would never need to have 4 digits for a date, and then it got to 1999 and we realized our computers would think it was 1900 and stop working. And so we've got a similar problem, but I would argue that the problem is bigger and a little less and vastly more uncertain. We do not know when a quantum computer, a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, will arrive, and therefore you have to start asking the question, If you think it is going to come in the next 5 years, if you think it's going to come in the next 10 years, 20 years, does that matter if the question is, are you comfortable that you will no longer be able to produce or run your business at the point that that quantum computer arrives? And if the answer is no, and I suspect the answer is no, then you need to get ready for it. You need to start doing the work as quickly as possible. And part of the other sort of like big sort of mantra of project management, of change management, is quick, fast, and cheap. You can pick 2 of those. You don't get to pick all 3. The longer you wait, the more expensive it's going to be, or the less good it is. I just realized I made a mistake. Quick, good, and cheap. I say quick and fast and cheap. Quick, good, and cheap. You need it to be good and cheap, ideally. You're losing the option to have the fast. So it makes it more and more important that you have plans on what you're doing in this space and understand the threat. And there is a bit of a unique situation. 50 years of one algorithm, actually, as a cryptographer, that's pretty unusual. Most of the other algorithms, particularly in the symmetric cryptography space, haven't had that sort of tenure. RSA, ECDSA have had a long tenure. We have almost got lucky with it. And what we need to do, as well as we prepare for a quantum safe future, is we need to think about the next step, which is the cryptographic agility. That is the ability that once you've made all these changes, which are going to be wide ranging and are going to be not just industry wide, but worldwide, you need to have the ability, you need to understand how could you do it again if you had to do it at very short notice. Yeah, and I think that's one of the key messages. Start now, because it will get complicated. It isn't going to be a case of you can just, do a few changes over a weekend. It is going to be a case of embed it into your culture, embed it into your practices, embed it into your systems, and additionally your partners. And hopefully that gives a good answer. And I don't know if any of my colleagues on the panel would like to add any apart from their side.
Yeah. I have a couple of things to add, Will. So one of the things we're seeing is that the crypto supply chains for the large organizations seem to sometimes be very complex, and there is a very broad vendor base. And when I see a large organization with a very broad vendor base, I immediately think that is going to be very tricky to get that vendor base crypto agile. Yeah. So just thinking about the supply chain complexity you have around your crypto posture, I think is key. And the other thing is, what we're seeing is a lot of organizations know what data they have that is critical for harvest now, decrypt later, but they may not always know where that data is flowing. And the problem is, you may be able to map part of where it's flowing internally with you, but it's not enough to know where that is. You need to understand where it's flowing into your supply chain. So the crypto posture of your supply chain may be equally or sometimes more important, because you are only as good as the weakest link in your supply chain.
Yeah, and this echoes back to my comment about this is a global problem. So let me say that if I at HSBC said, let's divert all of our funds to making ourselves an entirely quantum safe, cryptographically post-quantum crypto organization, and then we get there so fast and switch off all of our legacy cryptography that nobody can talk to us or connect with us, that's just as bad a risk as nobody been able to guarantee the security of what's actually happening. And it is important to be talking to supply chains, to partners, to anybody who is involved in your organization's ecosystem, to make sure that they understand that this is a collective journey and it is a global collective effort.
True. And I think I'll make a comment around the Y2K thing that you mentioned there. So we knew when the date was for Y2K. So we had plenty of time to prepare. We got all the COBOL developers out of retirement, Fortran developers, and we got everything fixed in time. Problem here, excuse me, is that we don't know when what they're calling Q day, when Q day is going to be. We don't know when that day is. And the next few slides, we're going to provide some guidance based on what the industry is saying as to when we think, well, not when we think Q day is going to be, but when we think you really need to be preparing. Yes, we're saying prepare now, but there's also some transition timelines that we'll have in the next slides. Oh, there it is.
There it is, yeah.
So yeah, as I mentioned, we have some recommendations here and some facts. We know that NIST standardized the algorithms back in 2024. And we have recommendations from the industry, from Gartner, from NIST in the United States, and some other governments when they're going to start deprecating the current classical algorithms. Geir, do you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I think what we saw was the notice from Google coming out, which I think for us made the 2029 date a little bit more firm. I don't know, maybe Dean, you have some more information on exactly what that was, but to me, when I read that posting, I immediately thought that we need to take that 2029 date very seriously now.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, there's been increasing developments around quantum computers. Originally it was thought that we needed thousands and thousands of these qubits in order to have a quantum relevant computer that could break RSA encryption. And now we're seeing with some improved algorithms and some tweaks that are being done that number is dropping. And because we don't need as many, and it becomes much more expensive and complicated to have quantum computers with a lot of qubits, if we can do it with less qubits and the right algorithms, then that date becomes maybe even closer and threatening today's classical encryption algorithms. And I think this is why what Will was saying is we need to start moving now.
So Dean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I see it as two lines. We have a projected line of the number of qubits that we have in the world and the number of qubits that are available on quantum computers. We have a decreasing line of the number of qubits required. And I think that with what Google have said, we've seen a sort of a jump, and the numbers that are coming out tend not to just reduce it by a few percent. They tend to reduce it by a factor of 10. They tend to really be big pushes and big drops in that number, as opposed to the thing that might make us comfortable, which would be a nice linear progression. We're not really seeing that at the moment.
And I think just to add to that, I think we have been surprised to see a lot of the critical supply chain that large life sciences companies, banks, etc., are using. Quite often are optimizing for interoperability instead of security in their endpoints, and we have been very surprised sometimes to see the level of encryption that is offered from these companies. You need to kind of understand what your supply chain is doing. We think that's really critical.
And I think the crypto agility comment that Will made earlier is very relevant here, because even though we have proved algorithms from NIST and others, there's nothing to prevent one of those algorithms from failing in the future. And if that's the case, you need to be able to move on to a new one, and your hardware supplier of your HSM has to be able to support that in a rapid fashion. Think about what happened 10 years ago, or even more, when we transitioned from SHA-1 to SHA-2 of a hashing algorithm there. It took a long time. In fact, it took about 10 years for that transition to be completed. And we still see out in the wild organizations using SHA-1 when it's been proven that is weak. So that was complicated. Now we've got hardware involved with PQC. So it's going to be even more complicated. So if it's going to take 10 years or more, that's why folks are saying you got to start now, because if a quantum relevant computer comes out by 2030 or 2035, we're already too late to start the transition.
Yeah, no, I agree. This whole process is becoming escalated. It's escalating pretty fast, to be honest with you. And I know the 2029 date, I'm just hoping that it stays there and it doesn't approach any faster, just because there is a bit of unknown here that I think that a lot of organizations are not prepared for. And the strategies have not been thought out. And this is a key area where I think that we're all kind of valuable here, where we can spread awareness here in this space, which is, I think this is a good transition for the next topic, is to understanding how complex this is in the transition of it, right? This is going to be, I think that overall, I think that best practices are going to be needed to create it on the fly. I know the strategies are already being discussed, but best practices are not out there in terms of as a full network. I think this is probably a good slide for you to discuss, Geir. I think this one is I think you probably in your organization, you guys probably have something that you guys are already dealing with around these transitions.
So yeah, I'm sure Will has something to say here as well. So what we're seeing is that we specialize on the public side, and what we're seeing is that the problem space is often a lot larger than what most organizations think it is. I looked at an organization yesterday, and they had about 60,000 endpoints to look at. And you can just imagine how do you even start doing that? So I think the complexity is very, very high. And then if you add on the supply chain into that company, it becomes very deep. And you have to also look at the supply chain of the supply chain, because you need to make sure that the whole chain is actually up to scratch. So I can only imagine, Will, how tricky it is in an organization your size based on the numbers we're seeing.
Yeah, I'd like you to get in touch with the people with the 60,000 endpoints and just let them know that I'm a little bit jealous. We have more than that. And yes, that is the point. And so there is a very important thing that will vary across organizations, being no uncertain terms about it, and financial institutions are arguably one of the earliest adopters of computing systems. They were the first people to say, hey, we could do with these things that can handle lots of numbers for us, because our entire business is based on recording numbers accurately. And so we have legacy and old systems across the entire organization. And I've used a word I don't like using. I don't necessarily use the word legacy very often, because when we talk about something that is a legacy system, what we tend to mean is this is a system that still exists in your organization and has been unchanged for a period of time. There will be a reason why it has been unchanged for a period of time. So as somebody who works in IT, it's very easy for me to say, oh, you shouldn't be using that, it's legacy. But the answers can sometimes be, well, actually, that is a critical part of our infrastructure. Huge amounts of other things depend on that thing working, and the complexity of making changes to that is astronomical compared to, can we update our laptop estate? Yeah, that's relatively straightforward. You just drop the patches down, you just change them, and there might be a large volume there, but you do have these critical systems within an organization where you have to understand and you have to provide a service to the business, because the business is the one that is ultimately making the money, and be able to say, well, let's work out how we are going to protect those systems, as opposed to, oh, you just need to patch this, or you just need to change this. It doesn't necessarily work. So the complexity that can build in and can lean in, back to Dean saying, yeah, you had to go and get the Fortran programmers out for the year 2000. There are organizations in this world where that problem will exist, where you will have to say, these are systems which have been developed and standing for many years, which need to have that post-quantum capability added onto it. It's also, worth looking at another question and a slight sort of move on to the next topic here, which is, where is cryptography typically embedded across enterprise infrastructures and applications? I'm going to give you a very flippant answer: everywhere. It is not a case of saying, hey, go and sort out that little bit of cryptography that you've got. In an organization like HSBC, the cryptography is everywhere. And when we started talking about, well, we need to make a move towards post-quantum cryptography, and this is something that certainly people were previously advising on, is, well, the first thing you need to do is to go and get the inventory. You need to go and understand where all your cryptography is and what cryptography is vulnerable. Now, I will say, as a cryptographer, absolutely, yeah, you definitely need that. You 100% need an inventory of where all your cryptography is and what it all is, and just so that you have a complete and holistic picture. As a realist, I would also say, I can tell you without looking that most of your connectivity across your network is depending on vulnerable algorithms. It's depending on stuff which is going to be made vulnerable by a quantum computer. And so I advocate a couple of things. I advocate that, yes, you absolutely need that inventory. you also need to look at what you can do now to start making those migrations, because it would be great if you can get to a point where you say, hey, we've got a cryptography inventory, and also we can tell you that X% of our stuff is already ready and it's already changed. I'm aware, Geir, obviously you know your product helps with some of that and some of that, shall we say, homework marking and progress marking.
So just what we're seeing is that organizations are doing a top-down and a bottom-up approach at the same time. So sometimes they can identify where they have the critical data, they can identify the systems where they have the critical data, and that's all well and good. And there's usually not that many of those. And then you get into these, you know, obviously for us it's public endpoints, but which there could be many of. But not all of those are as relevant. Some of them are relevant, but not all of them. And then the tricky bit is figuring out how do you take these, and again, there was like yesterday was one with 60,000, but it could be many, many 100,000. It could be extremely big. And how do you start classifying that inventory to figure out what matters and where? So you know, we have seen that a good job on that can only be done by the organization itself. But there are things that you can do to help identify where you need to look. And that is, sometimes it's very simple. You can look at, you know, how these endpoints are configured, how are they set up, how solid are they? And that may give you indicators into if these endpoints are dealing with critical data or not. So there are ways you can try and take that very, very large inventory. Obviously, doing a top-down may help you identify what really, really matters. But then you have all this other stuff. So that is, I think, quite a tricky job to do. So we classify things into 5 different categories. And I can tell you that 95% of endpoints usually ends up in the bottom one. It's like, this is for later. But there's always some of these endpoints that end up on top of the list that aren't identified by a top-down analysis. And then you talked about legacy systems, Will. There's another category of system that you need to be really careful of. And these are the unmanaged systems. Things that sit around that no one is responsible for, no one may know about, and they may still contain critical data. And I think everyone would be very surprised when they start looking into the numbers that most organizations have of these. So try and identify these things that may not have anyone accountable for them anymore. They may have been sitting there for many years. No one's updating them, no one's managing them, and they aren't considered legacy systems sometimes. But these are very, very, very important to identify and then either decommission. Quite often these things can be decommissioned because they are of a category where no one dares touch them just in case they do something, but no one knows what they are doing. So that's one of the things that we think is really, really important.
Yeah. And I want to make a comment about after you build this inventory is as you're mentioning here, is prioritizing really, what are the assets that you need to transition and you need to become ready. Credit card data passing over the internet is probably not valuable after more than a couple of years because the credit card data expires. So we might not prioritize that. But as Will was saying earlier, corporate secrets, patents, drug manufacturing, all things like that probably have a higher priority. So those are the ones that you want to transition first. I'll also mention a comment about legacy because I was approached after a talk I did on Monday from someone who said, we got 80% of our services on TLS 1.3. We've got 15% still though on 1.2. And we understand that does not work with PQC. You don't even want to know what the last 5% is on. But, this is, again, a situation where he's 80% ready to move. He's got another 15% that he's got to figure out, does it make sense to move it? Why isn't it moved to 1.3? I found out it was because of TLS inspection requirements within the bank. But these are kind of things that he has to figure out in order to move to PQC.
So again, Dave, I cannot stress the vendors or the supply chain enough. We quite often see the supply chain offering everything from TLS 1.0. You would be surprised sometimes, but they quite often do this because they're worried about interoperability. So just understanding what the posture is of your supply chain is also very key.
Exactly.
And in some cases, that's not just going to be a supply chain, that is a customer or a client of an organization that has that connectivity to you. And you have to make sure that you're willing to say, well, actually, if you're going to connect to us, we need you to be secure, because you need to understand where that risk is being consumed. So if you're left in a situation of having to provide TLS 1.0 to somebody who's connecting to you, you need to be able to say, who's not ready, where's the problem, what can we do to resolve this, because we need to move forward. And back again, I'll bang this drum every single time. It's a global problem, and you need to be able to support your peers, your colleagues, your clients, your suppliers, all of them, and we all need to work together on it. A little bit further before in the conversation, Dean mentioned Q-Day as the day when the CRQC arrives, and there's something I just want to pick up on that's on the slide in front of us, which is aligned with emerging industry standards and guidance. And one of the things that we use is Regulator Day. So banks are a highly regulated industry. So much as a quantum computer might or might not exist, in some cases, for some industries, many industries in fact, it won't be relevant. What will be relevant is when your regulator or your governing body says you must do this to protect your customers' data. And so it's also worth bearing in mind that the opinions and there are various consensus exams that you can go and find, which will give people's estimates of when a cryptographically relevant quantum computer will arrive. Those tend to feed into what regulators and to what government bodies actually say. So if they are saying you need to be ready for a quantum computer to exist by date X, whether that computer exists or not becomes a little less relevant. And there is also the question of, if a certain organization or nation state or somebody builds a quantum computer which can break RSA, are they definitely going to make that public? So we have to remember that it's not just a case of when one of the big companies in the quantum computing space comes along and says, hey, we've got this computer and it can do this. It could well be answered with, well, we've had one for years, it's just we didn't tell anybody.
Exactly. Good point. Trey, back to you.
No, this makes it a very dangerous space, especially in the age where so many businesses get acquired, right? And when these businesses get acquired, these systems, as they migrate off of one system onto another system, and they typically keep these systems active. And like you mentioned, no one maintains them. There's key data points there for intrusions that I think that definitely need to be more well thought out in terms of how companies are acquired in the future in this space. I think that it's going to definitely be a game changer in this space in business development. And I know this is one area that haunts engineering teams, especially as they deal with legacy systems that may have not been managed, and as they transition even financial data from that they've had stored somewhere from HubSpot to Salesforce, right? These different key information sectors that typically we forget about as we move on and as businesses grow, right? So I think this is a key area that we'll see more change in strategic thought in the near future. So we're pretty much at the Q&A session here, and I believe I'm going to just go to the chat to see what we have here. Bear with me. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and start out at the top here. It's a pretty interesting one. How do organizations identify where cryptography is being used across their systems, and if they don't already have a full inventory? That was one that looks like it's anonymous.
I think that's a good question for Geir.
Yeah, so we deal with the public inventory, and I can tell you that often what organizations think they have in their inventory quite often does not align with what actually should be in there. There's usually a significant percent difference that we can see, and then it's also one of the challenges is especially around development teams, because the velocity around development teams is getting so high that we're finding that the governance around what they do is often not well performed. So what we are seeing is that organizations may have very good, pipelines, CI pipelines, etc., at their core development activities, but a lot of these things, when you get into the more peripheral parts of the organization, may not be followed up according to what policies they have. So we're seeing that the inventories are usually lacking significantly.
And I think I would echo Will's comment earlier when he said that cryptography is everywhere. That is true. And while that might not be helpful in discovering where it is, it actually is helpful, because when you look at a system, you say, well, there's no cryptography here. Look deeper. It's probably there. You're just not seeing it on the outside, but it is everywhere. And you have to be very conscious to find out where that cryptography is. Is it something that you can upgrade, or you need a vendor to upgrade to make it quantum safe?
It is the case, Dean, and certainly my first question will be, well, how did you connect to it then?
Yeah.
You can't find the cryptography.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it is worth just understanding. And you will hear people talking about the CBOM, the cryptographic bill of materials. So that follows the SBOM model of saying, hey, tell us about all the software components of your application. And CBOM is something which it's complex because it's going to give you a lot of information. But clearly the point here is, if you've got important applications, look at whether you can create a CBOM. And sometimes with inventory and looking at cryptographic inventories and looking at me saying it's everywhere and it's massive and it's huge numbers, sometimes the point here isn't get that comprehensive inventory. Sometimes the point here is aim for the comprehensive inventory, because as long as you're going in the right direction, doesn't matter if you don't quite make it, but you're going in that direction. It's the old I think I once heard it phrased as, if you try to stand in your back garden and jump on the moon, but somehow land on the garage roof, people are going to be really impressed that you managed to jump onto the garage roof. Work your way towards something that might seem unachievable, because at least you will learn and you will go in the right direction when you're doing it. Yeah.
Good point.
I have another one here. How long do you realistically expect PQC migration to take for large enterprise companies? I think that's kind of like, it depends on the scale, right? I think that's kind of open-ended one here.
It is a bit, and I did mention a couple of things here. Yeah, you're right. It does depend on the scale. It also depends on the homogeneity or heterogeneity of your systems. Yeah. If you have a large number where you can say, well, 85% of my systems are Red Hat Linux on this version of this operating system, you have probably an easier job than somebody who says, well, we've got 20% of that, 30% of that, 5% of that, 10% of nobody really knows what that is. That complexity is going to add time. Or it's going to add expense if you need to work on multiple different paths at the same time. So when we look at how long will it take, it also turns into how much effort are you going to throw at it, and how much resource can you spare in order to make it happen.
It also, it depends on the priorities of your CISO. And if you think back to that first slide that I put up there, if your CISO is on the left side of that graph where it said, they're not believing in it yet, or they're angry, or they don't think it's that relevant yet, then that's not going to set a priority for your organization. So hopefully with this webinar and the resources that you'll be sent after the webinar, you can show that and hopefully convince them that this should be a priority if it's not already.
I have another good one here. It says, what bottlenecks have you identified across organizations to slow down the transition? Because I think this is a key one. Just because we all run into roadblocks in different organizations that kind of slow down the planning. I mean, obviously we have other projects that we're juggling at the same time. So trust me, I know how this can be, but are there like specific bottlenecks that you guys see or anticipate that could slow down the process in terms of preparing for transition?
Well, I'll just throw out a couple things. Obviously, it depends on the readiness of your vendors, as I think was mentioned earlier, whether it's hardware or software. You might have to wait a while for that to be ready. So that's one point. I don't know, folks, what else do you think?
It's just with any massive change program, the interruptions that you can have to that change program and the requirements to refocus resources on delivering against it can be as unexpected and spare. And one of the communication things that I do is I say, we've got this great big quantum computing problem to solve within cryptography. That does not preclude other problems with cryptographic algorithms. We are not at a non-zero risk state of some other cryptographic vulnerability appearing that can divert exactly the people who are working on this problem to something else. And that is always going to be the case. And that is just part of doing business. It's part of working in cybersecurity is you can have the best intent and the detailed and documented plans and all of the agile meetings that you want. But if somebody throws a whole suite of new problems into your direction, you're potentially going to have to react to those and then get back to the job as soon as you've done those. So it's having that capacity, it's having that ability to flex to deal with the issues as they arise.
Doesn't this come back to the agility point where, if you are on top of your supply chain and you have an agile supply chain, you can move faster. And I'm sure then another thing we're seeing is not directly for PQC, but we have the validity times for certificates changing over the next few years as well. And they're kind of intersecting these two problems because they're a little bit of it's the same underlying issue for some of them, where we're finding that people have supply chains in the crypto space where they just have too many suppliers and they don't have control of them. They need to do that consolidation.
Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned the shortening life cycle things, and obviously Dean will definitely have comments on this because this is a CAB forum. But one of the things that does lead me to highlight is, hey, if you're deploying stuff, you're a running business. Figure out what your anti-patterns are. Figure out exactly what the things are you should not be tolerating at this point. And so I am sure that Dean has no problem with me saying, you should be automating the renewal and management of your digital certificates.
Yeah,
in fact,
I just want to. Yeah, go ahead.
In fact, you should not be tolerating them not being automated.
Right. And just to clarify that comment about shortening certificate lifetimes, that applies to certificates for websites that are in compliance with the CA Browser Forum regulations. Other types of certificates don't necessarily have to do the same thing. So, but automation is becoming extremely important because there is no way an organization like HSBC, which I'm sure has hundreds and thousands of websites or server certificates out there, is going to be able to manage those manually when they come down to 47 days in 2029. That 2029 date, we're hearing a lot now. We're hearing it about shortening certificate lifetimes. We're hearing it about when Gartner's saying you should migrate to PQC. So that's becoming a very, very important, and it's only 3 years away, folks.
No, I have another one for you, Will. I think this is for financial institutions. Which asset classes are in scope? Like, for example, like payments, trading, interbank messaging, internal admin, backup, archives. What's the scope? I know it's all, but I guess to be honest with you, it would be all, in my opinion. But I guess in this case, it would be more like the prioritization of these assets as we transition to this space.
Yeah, Trey, you were just listing all of the assets that we have problems that we need to resolve in, and yeah, absolutely, we're not selective about which assets or what sort of infrastructure they're providing. What we have to do is look very carefully and say, where do we have the biggest risks? Where, first off, is a CRQC likely to cause us problems? So where do we have these the trust anchors where we need to work with it? So let's say, and being brutally honest here, one of the most important things is how we're facing off towards the internet. Because that cryptographically relevant quantum computer is going to be expensive to use. It's not the case that you're just going to be able to spin one up in your backyard and break any cryptography that you use. There will be a selectiveness about what you actually attack. And as a result, you need to look at what gets you the most impact. So digital trust facing towards the web is naturally one of the best targets. So everything that we're doing that's facing towards the internet, we have to migrate. We have to make sure that we're doing those changes. You then need to look at where might a CRQC allow an attacker to perhaps get a foothold within your organization and exploit it and be able to actually sort of fabricate an attack chain through it. So it's an interesting way to approach the problem, because you're doing the work that really is critical to the security of an organization, which is, where's your biggest risk? Where are the things that you absolutely depend on? And where, if the cryptography was broken, would you be able to say, hey, do you know what? We're probably not a bank anymore. Or do you know what? We have a severe risk to our customers' data, and we have a severe risk to our ability to meet the many obligations that we have around the world. That was a slightly drawn out way of saying, yeah, everything, Trey. We have to look at it, and we have to look at it through where the most risk is, and the most risk might appear in a payment system. It might appear in an invoicing system. We have to find it, and we have to work out how to fix it quickly.
Are there tools tools to discover like a comprehensive list of assets? Are there anything that is it, to kind of like any tools or methods to kind of make sure you're capturing all of the assets, or is that not doesn't exist right now?
So yeah, so generally organizations will have their CMDBs, their databases of all the assets within the organization, and they will have highlighted which assets are particularly important. And in a banking environment in particular, and I'm sure in many other industry sectors, there are guidelines on what is you should consider to be your most important assets, and you're able to apply those rules and say, hey, this system that does X is considered to be fundamental to our operations. And when you're dealing with an organization the size of HSBC, sometimes that comes down to well, actually that is facilitating trillions of dollars worth of payments. So that's not just important to HSBC, that's important to the global economy, and therefore, yes, you need to prioritize on those. But organizations should always be able to say, we know what our most important applications, we know what our most important services are. These are vital to our business to be successful, and therefore that is where we should focus our energies.
Oh, that's fair. I think we have time just for one more. And I apologize. There are a lot of questions here, so which is a good sign. And I wish we could maybe we'll follow up with the list on a few of these, but I think we only have time for one more here. In large enterprise, is talent constraints both in business and technology? What in terms of what do you guys see in terms of the issues here, like in large enterprises? Is it like is it the talent as a constraint, or is it the technology in the business? What would you say in terms of this one?
I feel like any question that begins with large enterprise gets thrown up to me.
I'm sorry. It seems like a lot of people here are definitely either they're in a large enterprise or they plan to be.
So I'll do what I can here. It is multivariant, isn't it? And I think it's worth understanding a few different things here. So, as part of what I've been doing as in building up my cryptography team and building up the parts of the organization that'll do this, I'm a passionate believer in looking at emerging talent and seeing, where you can get the energy to look at new things. I'll also grab somebody else's question. Rahul, if you would like to ping me on LinkedIn. I'll either help you or I'll see if I can put somebody in contact to help with you to talk about PQC for access control, because it does sound very interesting. But you have to look at this, and there's a couple of things to be aware of, right? You need people who understand cryptography. You need people who understand what quantum computing is. You really, really, really need people who know how to upgrade and configure systems. Those people are not necessarily coincident. It would be wrong of me to say, oh, you should definitely, within your organization, go and hire yourself some very expensive quantum computing scientists, unless you have an application for quantum computing within your industry. It would be wrong of me to say, go and hire people who can understand cryptographic algorithms inside out and can do the maths on a pen and paper for you to show how cryptography works. The investments that are likely to be needed are in the ability to upgrade, maintain, and improve infrastructure. And by sheer and happy coincidence, those are the things that cybersecurity has said that you need to do for years. And so carry on that mission.
Thank you, Will. Well, had a pretty good audience, and obviously all of them. This is a pretty interesting topic, and we greatly appreciate you all for joining and listening to us talk about this, because we do view this as a very important topic that all organizations should be planning for. So whether you're whatever part of the scale of the enterprise you're on, or whether you're on a mid or large enterprise scale, there's no wrong reason here. You need to be preparing and need to have at least a plan in place before Q Day. So thank you for my guests. I thank you guys for joining. It's been amazing. I've learned a lot. I think everyone on the call has, and we really appreciate your time in this space, and you all have a great day. Take care, everyone.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.